163 square kilometers. That is the entire land surface of Easter Island, a volcanic outcrop so remote that its nearest inhabited neighbor lies 1,400 miles away, and the coast of South America sits 2,300 miles further east. You are looking at a fragment of rock surrounded by 165 million square kilometers of open Pacific Ocean, and on that fragment, the people of Rapa Nui raised 887 stone monuments, some standing 30 feet tall, some weighing 80 tons, without metal tools, without a wheel, and without contact with any outside civilization for centuries. The official story says they destroyed themselves in the process of building those monuments. That story is wrong, and the evidence that dismantles it is more interesting than the story it replaces. Hit subscribe before we go deeper. This isn't information you stumble on twice. Lock it in. Click. Now. For 20 years, Easter Island has served as the world's most convenient cautionary tale. In 2005, Jared Diamond's best-selling book, Collapse, gave millions of readers the explanation. The Rapa Nui people deforested their own island, destroyed their agricultural base, descended into starvation and internal conflict, and effectively ended themselves all in pursuit of building progressively larger statues. The Pacific navigation that had carried their ancestors to the most isolated landmass on Earth seemed, in Diamond's telling, to count for nothing against their own self-inflicted ruin. The lesson was clean. The metaphor spread to university lectures and climate conferences on 4 continents, and the archaeological discoveries accumulating since 2000 have systematically dismantled it. What? The soil core, obsidian, tool records, stone gardens, and colonial documentation actually show is a civilization that was sophisticated, adaptive, and ultimately destroyed by the arrival of the outside world, not by its own hand. We are going to walk through that evidence in 7 stages, and the first stage delivers its most important fact before you reach the 3-minute mark. The Easter Island collapse story. The version built into the Jared Diamond collapse myth, repeated in textbooks and cited in climate speeches on 3 continents, is not supported by the archaeological record. That is not a fringe position. It is the published consensus of the researchers who have spent the last 2 decades excavating Rapa Nui, and the weight of evidence has shifted decisively against the original thesis. Here is what Diamond's model claims. The Polynesian settlers who arrived around 1200 CE found a forested landscape dominated by a now extinct species of giant palm, a tree that grew over 60 feet tall and once covered the entire island. Over the following 4 centuries, the story goes, they cut down every last one, using the trunks as rollers and levers to transport their enormous stone statues. Without trees, the topsoil eroded into the sea. Without topsoil, crop yields collapsed. Without food, the population fell from a possible peak of 15,000 people to fewer than 3,000 by the time the Dutch explorer Jacob Roggeveen arrived in 1722. The Moai statues, in this reading, are monuments to a civilization so consumed by religious spectacle that it engineered its own extinction. It is a compelling narrative. It is also built on a chain of assumptions the excavation record has not confirmed. The first assumption was that deforestation and population collapse happened simultaneously and by the same cause. This inference came from pollen core samples taken in the 1980s, which showed a sharp decline in native palm pollen beginning around 1200 CE. But the leap from the forest decline to the people cut it down and then starved was never demonstrated in the data. It was inferred. When archaeologists Terry Hunt of the University of Arizona and Carl Leppo of Binghamton University re-examined the full excavation base in the early 2000s, that inference fell apart. Stop and translate that into physical reality. If a civilization is starving, it stops building. It stops mining. It stops maintaining the kind of organized labor that quarries, moves, and erects 80-ton stone figures. But the obsidian tool production record from Rapa Nui. Obsidian was the island's primary material for every cutting, scraping, and farming implement shows no collapse in output during the centuries Diamond's model requires. The tools kept being made at consistent rates. The communities kept functioning. the labor system kept operating. What the full excavation record shows is a population that remained stable and adaptive right up to the moment the first European ships appeared in 1722, not collapsing. Enduring. The distinction between those two words is the entire argument, because what the people of Rapa Nui were doing during those centuries of supposed self-destruction was solving one of the most demanding agricultural challenges any island community has ever faced, using nothing but the volcanic rock beneath their feet. That solution had a name, and the name would not be discovered until research. The population of Rapa Nui did not collapse before European contact. Both tool production records and excavation site data show communities that were organized and actively adapting through the very decades Diamond's model describes as terminal decline. This is not a minor revision of the collapse thesis. It is an inversion of its most fundamental claim. The obsidian evidence alone is precise enough to stand on its own. Obsidian, a naturally occurring volcanic glass that fractures into edges sharper than surgical steel, was the raw material of daily life on Rapa Nui. Every tool used to farm, fish, carve, and build was made from it. Because obsidian does not decay, every fragment left behind becomes a permanent data point. When Hunt and Lipo mapped the production rates and geographic distribution of obsidian tools across the full archaeological record, two specific findings emerged. First, the tools were being produced at consistent rates across the centuries leading up to 1722. Second, the distribution of production sites showed no geographic contraction, no communities abandoning their territory, no population concentration in a single survival zone of the kind you would expect to find in a starvation event. Consider what that means. A civilization under existential stress simplifies, it retreats. It stops investing organized labor in anything beyond immediate survival. The Rapa Nui record shows the opposite. A population that, even as the palm forest was disappearing from around it, kept producing and distributing the material infrastructure of daily life. And then came the discovery that reframed the entire picture. Lithic mulching, the deliberate fracturing of volcanic basalt into small fragments and mixing them into garden soil, changed the terms of the argument entirely when modern researchers finally recognized it for what it was. At first reading, the technique seems counterproductive. Why would you add rock to a garden? The answer is in the geochemistry. As volcanic basalt fractures and weathers, it releases mineral nutrients into surrounding soil. It also traps moisture, reduces wind erosion, and stabilizes soil temperature across the dramatic day-to-night swings that make tropical island farming unreliable. The Rapa Nui people didn't stumble onto this. They engineered it. Aerial photography and ground-level surveys conducted between 2010 and 2018 revealed that lithic mulching gardens covered between 2 and 5 square miles of the island's surface maintained agricultural infrastructure requiring planning, organized labor, and multi-generational knowledge. These were not random patches of broken rock. They were engineered growing systems, laid out across the volcanic landscape with the same spatial logic that guided the placement of the Moai themselves. The irony is that these gardens were invisible from the deck of a ship. When Jacob Ragaveen arrived in 1722, he saw a treeless island and read devastation. What he was looking at, from a railing a quarter-mile offshore, was a working agricultural system built into the ground. The absence of trees was not evidence of a collapsed civilization. It was the terrain a surviving civilization had learned to work with. So what happened to the trees? The people of Rapa Nui cut some of them for canoes, for structures, for tools. But the complete deforestation that Diamond's model requires was driven by something else entirely. Something that arrived in the first canoes. Something that moved without asking and multiplied without limit. It weighed approximately as much as a house cat. The trees of Easter Island were not cut down by the people of Rapa Nui. They were eaten by the Pacific wrath, Ratus exulans, which arrived as an accidental stowaway in the first canoes and found an island with no natural predators, an abundance of palm seeds, and nothing to stop it. This is not speculation. Paleobotanical analysis from multiple sites found ratnod, palm, seeds, and nuts throughout the archaeological record in quantities that rule out coincidence. The giant palm of Rapa Nui reproduced slowly. Each tree took decades to reach reproductive maturity, and its seed crop was its only pathway to regeneration. The Pacific rat reproduced fast. A single breeding pair can produce dozens of offspring in a year, on an island with no owls, no snakes, and no competing rodents. The population mathematics are straightforward. The rats consumed the palm seed crop faster than the forest could replace itself, generation after generation, until the last mature palm stood alone and had nowhere to pass its genes. The people of Rapa Nui did not choose to bring the rats. They were an ecological consequence of crossing 2,300 miles of open ocean in a wooden canoe. The deforestation was tragedy. It was not moral failure. Stop and consider what that shifts. It shifts the cause of the island's transformation from human greed to the unintended consequences of human movement. The same process by which invasive species arrive today in shipping containers and ballast water. The Rapa Nui built a civilization in response to the conditions they found, and part of that response was the Moai. Now consider what the walking statues were actually for. The term walking statues is not a metaphor. The Moai were moved upright on their flat bases using opposing teams pulling ropes attached to the figure's upper torso, a controlled rocking motion that advanced each statue across the landscape, one deliberate tilt at a time. Carl Leppo and Terry Hunt demonstrated this experimentally in 2012, moving a 10-ton replica along a road using 3 ropes and a crew of 18 people. The technique works. The statues were walked into position, but their placement tells the more important story. Research conducted between 2012 and 2019 found that the positions of the Moai across the island correlate directly with the locations of underground freshwater lenses, the natural reservoirs that form beneath volcanic islands. When rainwater percolates through porous rock above the saltwater table, on an island with no rivers, no lakes, and no permanent surface water, locating and marking reliable freshwater access was not symbolic. It was survival infrastructure. 887 stone figures, some weighing 80 tons, not monuments to ego, not artifacts of religious excess. A distributed engineering system for marking and managing water access across a treeless volcanic island, built by a people who had lost their forest and were methodically solving the problems that loss created. That reframes everything. The labor committed to them, the resources allocated to them, and the decision to walk them upright rather than drag them across a landscape that needed to remain farmable. That is not the behavior of a civilization in decline. That is the behavior of a civilization that had learned to read its own island. But the most unsettling part of this story is still ahead. In 1862, Peruvian slave ships arrived at Rapa Nui and took approximately 1,500 people in a single raid, nearly half of the surviving population, to work the guano mines off the coast of South America. Most died within months. A small number were returned to the island after diplomatic pressure from the Catholic Church. They brought smallpox back with them. That sequence is documented in Peruvian shipping records, in Chilean diplomatic correspondence, and in the accounts of Catholic missionaries present on the island during the aftermath. It is not contested, and it is the actual beginning of the end, not the deforestation. Not the statue building, not any process the people of Rapa Nui had initiated themselves. The civilization those slave ships found in 1862 had, at some point in its history, done something that only a handful of cultures in all of recorded human history had independently managed. It had invented a writing system, Rongo Rongo, the name given to the system of glyphs carved into wooden tablets discovered by missionaries in the late 19th century, remains one of the great unsolved linguistic mysteries of modern scholarship. 26 objects bearing Rongo Rongo inscriptions survive today, held in museum collections across Europe and the Americas. No one can read them, not because the language has been lost to time, but because the people who could read it were taken. The slave raid of 1862 and the epidemic that followed killed the literate class of Rapa Nui within a decade. The knowledge of what the tablets said, whether Rongo Rongo was logographic, syllabic, or something else, entirely died with them. The independent invention of writing has occurred, by most scholarly estimates, 4 times in human history: in Mesopotamia, in Egypt, in China, and in Mesoamerica. Rongorongo may represent a fifth instance, an entirely independent cognitive achievement by a civilization living on a fragment of volcanic rock in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, with no contact with any other writing tradition. That possibility survives today in 26 tablets that nobody can read, scattered across institutions that collected them without knowing what they held. By 1877, the indigenous population of Rapa Nui had fallen to 111 people, down from estimates of several thousand at European contact, which was itself already a reduced population from the island's earlier periods. The collapse that Diamond attributed to ecological self-destruction had, in fact, occurred. But it occurred in the 1860s and 1870s, not the 1600s. Its cause was a slave raid, a returning disease, and the forced relocation of survivors to Tahiti by the Chilean government. The civilization that built watermarking monuments, farmed volcanic rock, and independently invented a script was not brought down by its own vanity. It was dismantled by a 20-year sequence of events that arrived from the outside. What remains is not a cautionary tale about environmental mismanagement. It is a question about who gets to name the cause of death. The question of why the collapse narrative survived and why it spread so far before the corrective scholarship caught up is, in its own way, as revealing as the history itself. Diamond's thesis was not fabricated. The pollen record was real. The deforestation was real. The reduced population at European contact was real. The error was in the causal chain, in the assumption that these facts were connected by human agency, that the Rapa Nui had done this to themselves, and that the resulting pattern constituted a universal lesson about civilization and resource management. The thesis constructed a moral architecture from incomplete data, and that architecture was irresistible to a specific audience at a specific moment. Re-examine the timing. Diamond's collapse was published in 2005, at the peak of 3 decades, during which ecological catastrophe narratives had become the primary framework for thinking about civilization's relationship with the natural world. Earth Day, acid rain, the ozone layer, the Kyoto Protocol, an entire generation of educated adults had grown up inside the idea that human consumption produces ecological collapse. Diamond offered what appeared to be a perfectly documented historical case study. The story confirmed what the audience already believed. That is a powerful accelerant for the spread of any idea, accurate or not. The archaeological discoveries that corrected the thesis were published mostly between 2006 and 2019. They received a fraction of the attention Diamond's book had received. The corrected story is more complex. It involves invasive rodents and volcanic geochemistry and experimental archaeology and colonial shipping records. It does not reduce to a single image or a clean metaphor for environmental policy, which is precisely why it has remained largely within the academic literature while the original narrative continued circulating in lecture halls. This is how selective history works. Not through deliberate suppression, but through the natural tendency of complex, exonerating evidence to travel more slowly than simple, blaming explanations. What the Rapa Nui story actually teaches, if we accept the corrective record, is something more demanding than Diamond's version. It teaches that a civilization built without metal, without outside trade, and without a wheel, developed advanced stone engineering, a sophisticated water management system, an agricultural technique derived from indigenous knowledge of volcanic geochemistry, and an independent writing system, and that this civilization was effectively erased within 20 years of sustained contact with the outside world. Not because it failed, because the outside world arrived and made choices. The question that corrected history poses is not really about Easter Island. It is about which stories we elevate, which explanations we find acceptable, and why the narrative where the colonized civilization bears responsibility for its own destruction was the one that entered the global canon. The island's history, assembled correctly from the full excavation record, is not a story of civilizational failure. It is the story of a community that navigated the most isolated expanse of water on Earth, arrived on a volcanic rock with no trees, no rivers, and no metal, and built over 6 centuries a civilization that engineered its own water infrastructure, invented an agricultural technique from volcanic geochemistry, moved 80-ton stone figures on ropes with coordinated precision, and developed a script that may represent one of the rarest intellectual achievements in recorded human history. That civilization was not destroyed by its own hand. It was destroyed first by an accidental ecological cascade, a stowaway rat in a canoe, and then 3 centuries later, by slave ships and returning disease that arrived within a single generation and left 111 people standing where thousands had lived. And so, the question that remains is not about the island. What does it reveal about us? That the story we chose, the one that spread globally, entered textbooks and university curricula, and was cited in policy speeches on 4 continents, was the story where the victims bore the responsibility for their own destruction. 887 stone figures still stand at the edge of an ocean that offered them no escape route. They are still there. The island did not collapse. It was taken. This is the kind of history that never makes the front page. Subscribe, and we'll keep finding it together.